If you are like most people, you probably have a corner of the yard, garage, shed, or basement filled with old things you haven't touched in years. An old wheelbarrow with a broken tire, rusty buckets, worn-out wooden chairs, empty glass jars, maybe even an old bicycle that nobody rides anymore. Most people look at these things and see junk. They think the only solution is to throw them away, haul them to the dump, or let them sit there collecting dust. And that is exactly where the biggest mistake happens. What many gardeners never realize is that some of the most beautiful and useful garden decorations are often the things they already own. I learned this lesson many years ago when I was cleaning out my shed. I had a pile of old items ready for disposal. Nothing special, just things that seemed too old to be useful. But instead of getting rid of them, I decided to try something different. I started finding simple ways to give those items a second life in the garden. Not expensive projects, not complicated woodworking, just easy ideas that took very little time and almost no money. What surprised me was not how good they looked. What surprised me was how useful they became. An old bucket became a flower display that attracted pollinators. A broken chair turned into a plant stand that saved space. Even an old bicycle became one of the most talked about pieces in the yard. Visitors would ask where I bought these decorations. They were always shocked when I told them they came from things I was about to throw away. The truth is that many people spend hundreds of dollars on garden decor without realizing that the best materials are often already sitting at home. And unlike store-bought decorations, these pieces have character. They tell a story. They make a garden feel personal instead of looking like every other yard on the street. Today, I want to show you 15 of my favorite garden decorations made from old unwanted items. Some are beautiful. Some are practical, most are both, and every single one can be created with very little effort and almost no cost. The first few ideas are incredibly simple and most people already have everything they need. But one forgotten item near the end of this list completely changed the way I use space in my garden, and almost nobody thinks about it anymore. The first thing I always tell people is to stop overlooking old metal buckets. Most of us have at least one sitting somewhere with a crack, a rust spot, or a handle that's barely hanging on. Years ago, I almost threw several away because they were too worn out to use for carrying water. Then, an older neighbor showed me something that completely changed my mind. He drilled a few drainage holes in the bottom, filled them with soil, planted colorful flowers, and lined them along a garden path. The result looked better than many expensive planters I had seen at garden centers. The rust actually made them look more natural. They blended into the garden instead of standing out like plastic containers. What most people do not realize is that these buckets are not only decorative, they are portable. If a plant needs more sun, you simply move the bucket. If frost is coming, you move it closer to shelter. It is one of the easiest garden decorations you can make. Another forgotten treasure is old wooden crates. Many people leave them in garages until the wood starts falling apart. I use them as raised displays for herbs and flowers. A crate lifted slightly off the ground creates layers in the garden. Suddenly, plants that were hidden become visible. It makes a small garden feel larger without adding more plants. The third idea came from something I found behind my shed, an old wooden chair with a broken seat. Most people would consider it useless, but if you remove the damaged center and place a flower pot where the seat used to be, it becomes a beautiful garden feature. Visitors always notice it. It draws attention without looking expensive or artificial. Then there are glass jars. I know many people save them and never find a purpose for them. Place small solar lights inside and line them along a pathway. During the day, they look simple. At night, they create a warm glow that completely changes the feeling of the garden. The cost is almost nothing if you already have the jars. What I like most about these first ideas is that they require very little work. No advanced skills, no expensive tools. Just a few simple adjustments and suddenly old junk becomes something useful again. But the next decoration on my list surprised me even more because it started with an item most people cannot imagine using in a garden at all. The first time I saw it, I honestly thought the owner had lost his mind until I saw what happened a few weeks later. The next decoration started with an old bicycle that had not moved in years. Maybe you have one leaning against a wall right now. Flat tires. Rust on the chain. Nobody wants to ride it anymore. Most people see scrap metal. I see one of the easiest garden centerpieces you can create. A few years ago, I cleaned up an old bicycle, left most of the rust alone because it added character, and attached small flower baskets to the front and rear. I parked it near a flower bed and planted trailing flowers that spilled over the sides. Within a month, it looked like something from an old country garden. People stopped and asked where I bought it. The funny part was that it cost me almost nothing. Even better, it became a natural support for climbing plants. A simple decoration suddenly had a practical use too. Another forgotten item is an old ladder. Most families have one hidden somewhere that is no longer trusted for climbing. Instead of throwing it away, open it and place flower pots on each step. You instantly create a vertical garden. This works especially well in small yards where space is limited. One old ladder can hold herbs, flowers, or even strawberries without taking up much room on the ground. What I like about this idea is that it adds height. Many gardens look flat because everything sits at the same level. A ladder changes that immediately. Then there are old tires. I know some people dislike them, but when used carefully they can become attractive garden features. Paint them a simple color, stack one or two together, fill them with soil, and you have a raised planter. They are especially useful for growing flowers that need well-drained soil. Years ago, an older gardener showed me how he used old tires to create colorful planting islands around his vegetable garden. It cost him almost nothing and helped define different areas of the yard. Another idea that many people overlook is using old teapots and kettles as decorative planters. A rusty kettle with flowers growing from the top creates a unique look that feels personal and welcoming. It becomes a conversation piece without trying too hard. The secret behind all these decorations is that they serve more than one purpose. They add beauty, save money, and often solve practical gardening problems at the same time. But now we are getting into some of my favorite ideas because the next few decorations do something many expensive garden ornaments fail to do. They actually help the garden itself become healthier and more productive. One of the most useful decorations I ever added to my garden started with something most people throw away without a second thought: old wooden pallets. For years, I ignored them. Then, an older gardener showed me how to stand one upright against a fence and turn it into a vertical planting wall. The spaces between the boards became perfect spots for small flower pots and herbs. Suddenly, an empty fence looked alive. The best part was that it saved space while adding color. If your garden is small, this idea can completely change the way it feels. Another forgotten item that works surprisingly well is an old wheelbarrow. Even if the tire is ruined and the handles are worn, it can still become one of the most attractive features in the yard. Fill it with soil and plant a mix of flowers that bloom at different times. Because the wheelbarrow sits above ground level, it naturally draws attention. It creates a focal point that makes the entire garden look more organized. I have seen people spend hundreds of dollars trying to create the same effect. An abandoned wheelbarrow can do it for free. Then there are old drawers from broken dressers or cabinets. Most people see garbage. I see ready-made planting boxes. Simply place them directly on the ground, fill them with soil, and plant flowers, lettuce, or herbs. The weathered wood often looks better with age. Some gardeners even stack drawers of different sizes to create a layered display that gives the garden depth and character. Another favorite of mine is using old bricks or pieces of broken concrete. Years ago, I collected a pile that someone was throwing away. Instead of hauling them to the dump, I used them to create borders around flower beds and vegetable plots. Not only did they make the garden look cleaner, but they also helped keep mulch and soil where it belonged. This is one of those decorations that quietly improves the entire garden while looking completely natural. What many people miss is that the best garden decor often has a job to do. It is not just there to be seen. It helps organize space, supports plants, attracts attention to important areas, and makes maintenance easier. That is why these older methods continue to work decade after decade. And now we are moving into my favorite group of decorations, because the next ideas not only save money and improve appearance, but they also attract birds, pollinators, and beneficial insects that can help your garden thrive with less effort than ever before. One decoration that has given me more enjoyment than almost anything else started with a pile of old cups, bowls, and dishes that nobody wanted anymore. Most of them were chipped or missing matching pieces. Instead of throwing them away, I stacked them into simple bird-feeding stations. A large plate on the bottom, a cup in the middle, and another plate on top can create a beautiful feeder with almost no effort. Before long, I started seeing more birds visiting the garden. The decoration looked charming, but the real benefit was the birds helping control insects around the vegetable beds. That is something many expensive decorations cannot do. Another forgotten item is old wooden shutters. If you have ever replaced windows, you may have some hidden away in storage. Lean them against a fence or wall and use them as supports for climbing flowers. The slats create natural spaces for vines to grow through. Over time, the plants almost hide the shutter itself, creating a living wall of greenery and flowers. It is simple, inexpensive, and surprisingly effective. Then there are old metal watering cans. Even when they leak, they can still become beautiful garden displays. One of my favorite tricks is placing flowers inside and positioning the watering can at an angle so it looks as if blooms are pouring out onto the ground. It creates movement in the garden and catches the eye immediately. I first saw this many years ago in a small country garden, and I still use the idea today. Another decoration that serves a useful purpose is an old wooden barrel or half barrel. These make excellent planters for flowers, herbs, or even dwarf vegetables. Because they are larger than ordinary pots, they hold moisture better during hot weather. At the same time, they add a rustic look that fits naturally into almost any garden setting. What I have learned over the years is that people often underestimate how much wildlife appreciates these simple additions. Birds, butterflies, and bees are attracted to gardens that offer shelter, flowers, and water. Even something as simple as an old shallow dish placed on a stand can become a bird bath. It costs almost nothing and quickly becomes one of the busiest spots in the yard. The garden begins to feel alive in a completely different way. And that brings us to the final group of decorations. These are some of the easiest projects on the entire list, yet they often create the biggest visual impact. In fact, one of them uses an object that millions of people throw away every year without realizing how useful it can become in the garden. Dot, the next decoration, is one that almost nobody talks about anymore, even though it may be one of the cheapest and easiest ways to add character to a garden. I am talking about old glass bottles. For years, people saved them in boxes or tossed them into recycling bins without a second thought. But placed upside down along the edge of a flower bed, they create a colorful border that lasts for years. Green, blue, and brown bottles catch sunlight in a way that changes throughout the day. Early in the morning, they sparkle differently than they do in the evening. It is a simple effect, but it gives the garden a unique personality. Another favorite of mine is using old picture frames. Most people think of them as indoor items, but outdoors they can become surprisingly attractive decorations. An empty frame placed among flowers creates a natural viewing window. It draws attention to a particular plant or section of the garden. I once used an old weathered frame around a climbing rose, and visitors constantly stopped to admire it. It cost nothing because the frame was already sitting in storage. Then there are old baskets. Even if the handles are broken or the sides are worn, they can still become beautiful containers for flowers. Hanging baskets made from repurposed materials often look more natural than new ones from a store. They blend into the garden instead of looking manufactured. One forgotten trick that an older gardener taught me many years ago was to place baskets filled with seasonal flowers near vegetable beds. The flowers attracted pollinators while also making the growing area look more welcoming. Another idea that has become one of my favorites uses old tree branches. Instead of cutting them into firewood immediately, select a few interesting pieces and place them upright or weave them into simple garden borders. They create a rustic appearance that feels like it belongs in the landscape. Birds often use them as resting spots, and climbing plants can grow around them naturally. What makes all of these decorations special is that they are easy to repeat. Once you create one, you start noticing opportunities everywhere. Suddenly, an object that looked useless becomes a possibility. A broken item becomes a future planter. A forgotten object becomes a garden feature. You stop seeing junk and start seeing potential. And when that happens, decorating a garden no longer feels expensive or complicated. But before we finish, there is one final lesson I learned after years of using these methods, and it completely changed how I look at both gardening and everyday life. After all these years of gardening, I have come to a simple conclusion. The most beautiful gardens are usually not the ones filled with expensive decorations from stores. They are the gardens that reflect the people who care for them. When I walk through my own garden today, I do not just see flowers, vegetables, and pathways. I see an old bicycle that was headed for the trash. I see buckets that once sat forgotten in a shed. I see jars, crates, chairs, ladders, baskets, and wheelbarrows that found a second purpose instead of ending up in a landfill. Every piece has a story. Every piece serves a purpose, and that is what makes the space feel alive. The biggest advantage of these simple projects is not the money they save, although that can be substantial over time. The real benefit is that they allow anyone to improve a garden without waiting for the perfect budget, the perfect tools, or the perfect moment. Most of these ideas can be completed in a single afternoon. Some take less than an hour, yet the results can be enjoyed for years. I often hear people say they want a more beautiful garden, but believe it requires spending a lot of money. My experience has been exactly the opposite. Many of the most attractive features in my yard cost almost nothing because they were made from things I already had. What started as old unwanted items became planters, borders, bird feeders, vertical gardens, flower displays, and wildlife attractions. Along the way, they made the garden easier to maintain, more productive, and far more enjoyable to spend time in. If there is one lesson I hope you take away from this video, it is this. Before throwing something away, pause for a moment and imagine what it could become. A broken object may still have years of usefulness left. A forgotten item may become the centerpiece of your garden. Sometimes all it takes is looking at familiar things from a different angle. The next time you clean out a garage, shed, attic, or basement, do not focus only on what needs to go. Look for possibilities. You may discover your next favorite garden decoration hiding in a pile of things you plan to discard. And the funny thing is that once you start seeing opportunities this way, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Every season brings new ideas. Every old object suggests another project. And that is exactly why, in my next video, I want to show you some of the forgotten garden tricks older gardeners used to create productive and beautiful spaces with almost no money at all.